Sometimes rock bottom has an address, and for Ewan MacAllister it was a broken-down farm at the edge of nowhere. He'd lost everything that mattered, his wife, his savings, his sense of who he was, and all he had left was $400 and a dog named Rook. The farm was abandoned, the barn barely standing, and the town had long forgotten it existed. Ewan wasn't looking for miracles. He just wanted a place to breathe and maybe find a reason to keep going. Then one quiet evening, Rook started barking at the barn floor, wouldn't stop until Ewan came to look. Beneath those old boards was a hidden box, buried and waiting. Inside it held secrets that would tie his broken life to a family's tragedy from decades past. But what was in that box, and why would it change everything Ewan thought he knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auction had been held in a church basement that smelled of coffee and old hymnals. Ewan MacAllister sat in the back row, his worn jacket pulled tight against the October chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Around him, a handful of locals murmured to each other, their eyes sliding past him like he was already a ghost. He was 47 years old, and everything that had once defined him had been stripped away. 2 years ago, his wife Catherine had died of cancer, slowly, expensively, and despite every promise the doctors had made. The medical bills had consumed their savings first, then the equity in their home, and finally his construction business when he couldn't keep up with the work anymore. Grief, it turned out, had its own cost structure. His daughter Iris was 16 now, living with Catherine's sister in Billings. She had her own bedroom there, stability, a good school, everything Ewan couldn't provide. The last time they'd spoken, really spoken, not just exchanged stiff pleasantries, she'd asked him why he'd given up. He hadn't had an answer that didn't sound like an excuse. The auctioneer's voice droned through the list of properties. Farm equipment, a defunct grain silo, 2 residential lots in town. Then Lot 47, 40 acres with structures, formerly the Ashcroft Place out on County Road 16. Will start the bidding at $500. Silence filled the basement. Someone coughed. The auctioneer looked around with the weary expression of a man used to disappointment. "Do I hear 500? Ewan's hand went up before his brain could interfere. 400, the auctioneer blinked. "Sir, the starting bid is, it's all I have." Ewan's voice came out steadier than he felt. $400, cash. More silence. Then the auctioneer sighed and brought down his gavel. Sold to bidder 17 for $400. Just like that. Ewan owned 40 acres of Montana dirt and whatever remained of someone else's dreams. The realtor who handled the paperwork was a woman named Beatrice Kohler. She had kind eyes behind practical glasses and the sort of sensible haircut that suggested she'd stopped worrying about fashion sometime in the previous decade. When Ewan signed the deed, she looked at him with something between pity and concern. "You know the place has been empty since the 90s, right?" she said. "Before that it sat empty for 20 years. The barn's probably not safe, the well might be dry, and the house needs everything." "I know," Ewan said. "Do you have family? People who can help you fix it up?" He thought of Iris in her aunt's spare bedroom, choosing to stay there rather than with him. "No," he said. "Just my dog." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, then pulled a business card from her purse and wrote a number on the back. "That's my personal line. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you call me." "Understood." Ewan took the card, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you. Thornfield isn't a bad town," she said quietly. "We're just a tired one. Sometimes we forget to look out for each other the way we should." The drive to the property took 15 minutes down a 2-lane highway, then another 5 down a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been graded in a decade. Rook sat in the passenger seat of Ewan's truck, a 5-year-old shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and a graying muzzle. He'd been Catherine's dog originally, but after she died, Rook had attached himself to Ewan with fierce loyalty, as if understanding that they were both survivors of the same shipwreck. The farm appeared at the end of the road, like something from a faded photograph. The house was a single-story structure with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged on one side. The barn stood about 50 yards away, its roof missing shingles and its walls leaning at an angle that defied basic physics. Beyond them, the land stretched out in dry grass and scattered cottonwoods, all the way to the foothills in the distance. It was, objectively, a disaster. Ewan killed the engine and sat there, hands still on the wheel. This was it. This was what his life had come to. $400 and a property that nobody else had wanted. Rook whined softly and nudged Ewan's arm with his nose. "Yeah," Ewan said. "I know. Let's go see what we bought." The inside of the house was better than he'd feared, but worse than he'd hoped. The roof had held, so there was no water damage, but decades of dust covered everything. The kitchen cabinets hung crooked, the bathroom fixtures were rusted through, and something had nested in the walls. He could hear scratching and skittering when he stood still, but the bones were good. Solid timber framing, real plaster walls, hardwood floors under the grime. Someone had built this place to last. Ewan rolled out his sleeping bag on the living room floor that first night, using his duffel bag as a pillow. Rook curled up beside him close enough that Ewan could feel the dog's warmth. Through the broken window, he could hear the wind moving through the grass and the distant call of an owl. He touched the chain around his neck, feeling the weight of Catherine's wedding ring. He'd worn it there since the funeral, unable to put it in a drawer but equally unable to look at it on his hand. She'd loved the idea of a farm once, back when they were young and still believed in fresh starts. They'd driven past places like this and talked about someday. Someday had run out before they'd gotten the chance. In the darkness, Ewan closed his eyes and tried to imagine what he was supposed to do next. Fix the porch, probably. Get the well working. Make the place livable before winter came. Small goals, manageable steps. Nothing that required him to think too far ahead or remember too much about the past. Rook shifted closer, and Ewan rested his hand on the dog's side, feeling the steady rhythm of breathing. At least he wasn't completely alone. The next morning, he started with the porch. It was practical work, replacing rotted boards, reinforcing the support posts, cleaning out years of accumulated debris. The physical labor felt good, familiar. For a few hours, he could lose himself in the simple logic of carpentry: measure twice, cut once, check for level. A truck pulled into the drive around noon. An old man climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had logged too many hard years. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and pale blue eyes that didn't miss much. "You're the one who bought the Ashcroft place," the man said. It wasn't a question. Ewan MacAllister. Ewan set down his hammer and walked over, extending his hand. The old man shook it with a grip that was still strong. "Sterling Dunbar. I farm the property to the east. Wanted to see who was crazy enough to take this place on. That'd be me." Sterling looked around at the sagging barn, the overgrown fields, the house with its peeling paint. "You know anything about farming?" "Not a thing," Ewan admitted. "I was in construction before." "Before what?" "Before life got complicated." Sterling nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. "Well, if you need advice or equipment, I'm just down the road. Can't promise I'll have answers, but I've made most of the mistakes there are to make." It was the closest thing to a welcome Ewan had received since arriving in Thornfield. "I appreciate that. One more thing." Sterling's expression grew serious. "Folks around here don't talk much about the history of this place. The family that used to own it, the Ashcrofts, they didn't leave under good circumstances. Some people might be uncomfortable seeing the land occupied again. What happened to them?" Ewan asked. Sterling was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the barn. "That's their story to tell, not mine. But if you find anything, and I mean anything that belonged to them, you might want to think carefully about what you do with it." Before Ewan could ask what that meant, Sterling was already walking back to his truck. He raised one hand in farewell and drove off, leaving Ewan standing in the yard with more questions than he'd started with. That evening, as the sun dropped toward the horizon and painted everything in shades of amber and gold, Ewan stood in the yard and surveyed his property. Rook was sniffing around the barn, investigating every corner with the thoroughness of a detective. This place was broken, neglected, forgotten, just like him. But maybe, just maybe, broken things could be fixed. He was about to call Rook back to the house when the dog's behavior changed. The casual sniffing became focused, intense. Rook's ears went forward, and he started pawing at the barn floor in the northwest corner, right where the shadows were deepest. Then he started to bark. Sharp, insistent, frantic barks that didn't stop. Ewan crossed the yard, curious. "What have you got, boy?" But Rook wouldn't move, wouldn't stop barking. His paws scraped at the wooden boards, and something in his urgency made the hair on the back of Ewan's neck stand up. Ewan knelt down and examined the floorboards more closely. In the fading light, he could just make out a subtle difference in the wood, a slight discoloration, a gap in the spacing that didn't match the rest of the floor. He went back to the house for his crowbar. When he returned, Rook was still there, still barking. Ewan wedged the crowbar under the edge of a board and pulled. The wood groaned, nails shrieked, and then the board came free. Beneath it was darkness and the smell of old earth. Ewan pulled up 2 more boards, then reached for his flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows and illuminated a hollow space about 3 feet deep. And there, wrapped in oilcloth and surrounded by carefully packed dirt, was a metal box. Ewan carried the box back to the farmhouse as carefully as if it were made of glass. The metal was cold against his palms, rust flaking away under his fingers. Rook followed close at his heels, tail low, still making small, worried sounds in his throat. Inside, Ewan set the box on the kitchen table and stared at it under the light of his battery-powered lantern. The oilcloth had protected it well. The metal underneath was intact, though corroded at the edges. There was no lock, just a simple latch that had fused with age and moisture. His hands were shaking. He wasn't sure why. It was just an old box, probably filled with nothing more interesting than rusted tools or forgotten junk. But something about the way it had been hidden, buried beneath the barn floor with such obvious care, made his pulse quicken. He used a screwdriver to work the latch free. It took 10 minutes of careful prying before the mechanism finally gave way with a metallic click that sounded too loud in the quiet house. Ewan lifted the lid. Inside was a leather journal, its cover cracked and faded but still intact. Beneath it lay a stack of papers, ledgers, documents, photographs. He lifted the journal out first, feeling the weight of it. The way the leather had molded to the shape of whatever hand had held it decades ago. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the script of someone who'd been taught penmanship in a different era. At the top of the page, a date, April 15th, 1971. Below it, a single line, "We've finally done it. The land is ours." Ewan turned the page, and the voice of a stranger began to speak to him across the years. "Catherine cried when we signed the papers. Not sad tears, happy ones. She kept saying she couldn't believe it was real, that we actually owned 40 acres of Montana soil. The children don't understand yet what this means, but they will. David is only 8, Anne just 5, but someday they'll know what it takes to build something that lasts." The writer's name appeared a few paragraphs later. Calvin Ashcroft. Ewan read on, the lantern casting shadows that danced across the pages. Calvin wrote about building the barn, about planting their first crop, about his wife Irene's garden and the way the sunset looked from their porch. There was joy in these early entries, the kind of pure optimism that comes from believing you've found your place in the world. But as Ewan turned the pages, the tone began to shift. By the summer of 1972, Calvin was writing about the drought. The creek had run dry, the crops had withered, and money was getting tight. He'd taken a loan from the bank to cover expenses, confident that next year would be better. By 1973, next year hadn't been better. There were more loans, higher interest rates, and increasingly desperate attempts to make the numbers work. Calvin wrote about taking a second job in town, about Irene selling vegetables at the market, about cutting corners wherever they could. And then, in the fall of 1973, a name appeared that made Ewan's spine straighten. Harrison Lockhart. Mr. Lockhart stopped by today. Said he'd heard we were having some financial difficulties and wanted to offer his assistance. He seems like a decent man, well-dressed, well-spoken, with that easy confidence that comes from old money. He offered us a loan at what he called friendly rates. Interest of 12%, he said, which is lower than the bank. I should have asked more questions. But we're desperate, and desperate men make foolish choices. Ewan set the journal down and reached for the documents underneath. There were loan papers, signed and notarized, with terms that made his stomach turn even 50 years later. The interest wasn't 12%, it was 12% compounded monthly. There were hidden fees, balloon payments, clauses that gave Lockhart the right to call the loan due at any time for any reason. It was a trap, dressed up in friendly terms and a firm handshake. Calvin had realized it too, eventually. The later journal entries grew darker, more frantic. He wrote about trying to renegotiate, about going to lawyers who couldn't or wouldn't help, about discovering that Lockhart had connections with the county officials who should have protected them. I went to the courthouse today to file a complaint. The clerk, a woman I've known for 5 years, wouldn't meet my eyes. She said there was nothing that could be done, that the contracts were legal and binding. When I pressed her, she finally admitted that Harrison Lockhart's cousin is the county judge. His brother-in-law is the sheriff. Half the town council owes him favors. We're not fighting one man. We're fighting a system built to protect him. Ewan's chest tightened as he read. He knew this story. Not the details, not the names, but the shape of it. He knew what it felt like to watch everything you'd built crumble, while the people who should have helped stood by and did nothing. The photographs were near the bottom of the box. Ewan spread them across the table, studying the faces of people he'd never met. Calvin Ashcroft was a solid man with calloused hands and kind eyes. Irene was small and pretty, with laugh lines at the corners of her mouth. The children, David and Anne, looked like any farm kids, sun-browned and gap-toothed. There was one photograph taken in front of the barn, the same barn that was still standing 50 yards from where Ewan sat. The 4 of them stood together, Calvin's hand on Irene's shoulder, the children in front. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged. The final entries in the journal were from November 1974. They're taking it. Tomorrow, the sheriff will come with papers and we'll have to leave. I've tried everything, begging, reasoning, threatening legal action. Nothing works. Lockhart owns this county the way he's going to own our land. Irene is packing what we can fit in the truck. The children don't understand why we're leaving. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the world isn't fair? The next entry was shorter, written in a shakier hand. I've made copies of everything, the original loan documents, the ledgers showing how Lockhart manipulated the numbers, letters from the officials who refused to help. I'm hiding them where someone might find them someday. Maybe years from now, maybe never. But if there's any justice in this world, the truth will come out eventually. Irene thinks I'm being foolish. She's probably right, but I can't let this stand. I can't let him win without leaving some record of what he did. The final line was incomplete, the ink smeared, as if Calvin had been interrupted mid-sentence. If anyone finds this, that was all. The rest of the page was blank. Ewan sat back in his chair, his heart hammering. He looked through the other documents. There were ledgers showing payments, correspondence between Calvin and the bank, official notices of foreclosure. Everything Calvin had written about was here, documented, preserved. And then Ewan found the deed. It was near the bottom of the stack, yellowed with age but still legible. It showed the original sale of the property to Calvin and Irene Ashcroft in 1971. But there was another document attached to it, a foreclosure notice dated November 18th, 1974, transferring ownership to Harrison Lockhart. Ewan's construction business might have failed, but he still knew how to read contracts. And as he studied the foreclosure document, he saw what Calvin must have seen. The signatures didn't quite match. The notary stamp looked wrong. The legal descriptions of the property had subtle differences between documents. This wasn't just a foreclosure, it was fraud. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, the barn stood where Calvin had built it, where his children had played, where their dreams had died. The Ashcrofts hadn't just lost their farm. They'd been robbed, and 50 years later the evidence of that theft was sitting on Ewan's kitchen table. Rook whined and pressed against his leg. Ewan reached down and scratched the dog's ears absently, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do with this? The people involved were probably dead by now. The Ashcroft family had vanished. Sterling had said they didn't leave under good circumstances. What difference could any of this make half a century later? But then he thought about Calvin's words. If anyone finds this, Calvin had hidden these documents on purpose. He'd wanted someone to know the truth. He'd wanted his story told. Ewan looked at the photograph again, at the family standing in front of the barn, and felt something shift in his chest. For 2 years, he'd been drifting through life like a man already dead, too broken by grief to care about anything beyond getting through each day. But here was something real. A wrong that had never been set right. A family that had been forgotten. He picked up the journal and read Calvin's words again. Desperate men make foolish choices. Ewan understood that better than anyone, but maybe there was another choice available now. Maybe, after all these years, someone could finally make sure Calvin Ashcroft's voice was heard. He didn't know what that would look like yet, or if it was even possible. But as he sat there in the quiet farmhouse with a stranger's journal in his hands, Ewan felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Purpose. The night had grown late. Ewan carefully placed everything back in the box, except for the journal, which he set on the table beside his sleeping bag. Tomorrow he'd start asking questions. Tomorrow he'd begin to understand what had really happened here. But tonight he read Calvin's words by lantern light until his eyes grew heavy, and when he finally slept, he dreamed of a family he'd never met and a debt that had never been paid. Morning came, with pale light filtering through the dusty windows. Ewan had barely slept, his mind churning through everything he'd read. He made instant coffee on his camping stove and sat at the table, the journal open in front of him, studying Calvin's handwriting as if it might reveal something new. He needed to understand what had happened to the Ashcroft family. Calvin's journal ended abruptly in November 1974, but what came after? Where had they gone? And more importantly, were any of them still alive? At dawn, Ewan returned to the barn with his tools and a stronger flashlight. If Calvin had hidden one box, there might be others. He spent 2 hours examining every inch of the barn floor, tapping boards, looking for irregularities. In the northwest corner, where the first box had been buried, he found a smaller hollow space. Inside was a second metal container, this one no bigger than a shoebox. Ewan pried it open carefully. Inside were letters, correspondence between Calvin and a banker, mortgage payment receipts, and legal notices. But there was something else too, photographs of documents. The kind you'd take if you wanted to preserve evidence, but knew the originals might be taken from you. The photographs showed loan agreements with different terms than what Calvin had described signing. Interest rates that had been altered, payment schedules that didn't match, signatures that looked traced rather than original. This wasn't just Calvin's word against Lockhart's, this was proof. Ewan loaded everything into his truck and drove to Thornfield. The county records office was a squat brick building next to the courthouse, the kind of structure built in the 1960s with more concern for function than aesthetics. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of old paper hung in the air. A woman sat behind the counter, middle-aged with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up when Ewan entered, her expression professionally neutral. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for property records," Ewan said. And going back to the 70s, her eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a long time ago. What property?" 40 acres on County Road 16, the Ashcroft place." Something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe concern. "You own that property now?" "I do. Bought it 3 weeks ago." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm Beverly Strand." I've worked here for 22 years, but the records you're looking for go back further than that. They're in the archives. It'll take me some time to pull them. I can wait, Ewan said. Beverly disappeared into a back room. Ewan heard filing cabinets opening and closing, the rustle of paper, muttered counting. 20 minutes later, she returned with a stack of folders and spread them on the counter. Property records for the Ashcroft farm, she said. Original purchase in 1971, foreclosure in 1974. Looks like it changed hands a few times after that before sitting vacant. Ewan opened the first folder and began reading. The original deed was there, showing Calvin and Irene Ashcroft as purchasers. Then came the loan documents, but these were different from the ones Calvin had photographed. These showed lower interest rates, reasonable terms, nothing that looked predatory. Are these the original loan documents? Ewan asked. Beverly's expression became guarded. Those are the documents on file. What if the documents on file aren't the same as what was actually signed? She was quiet for a moment, then glanced toward the door, as if checking whether anyone was listening. When she spoke, her voice was lower. Mr. MacAllister, I've worked in public records for more than 2 decades. In that time, I've learned that sometimes the files tell the official story, not the true one. You're saying these documents have been altered. I'm saying that Harrison Lockhart was a very powerful man in this county. And powerful men have ways of making sure the records reflect what they want them to reflect. She paused. Why are you asking about this? Ewan made a decision. He pulled out his phone and showed her the photographs he'd taken of Calvin's documents. Because I found these buried under my barn floor. And they tell a very different story. Beverly's eyes widened as she looked at the images. She scrolled through them slowly, her expression growing troubled. Lord have mercy. He kept copies. You knew about this. Everyone who was around back then knew something wasn't right, Beverly said quietly. The Ashcrofts weren't the only ones. Between 1970 and 1975, 6 families lost their farms to foreclosure. All of them had borrowed money from Harrison Lockhart. All of them lost everything. What happened to the families? Most left the county. Couldn't afford to stay, couldn't stand the shame of it. The Ashcrofts, she stopped, choosing her words carefully. They left in November of 74. 2 weeks later, there was a car accident up on Highway 12. Calvin and Irene Ashcroft died. Their truck went off the road in icy conditions. The words hit Ewan like a physical blow. What about their children? Went into foster care. I don't know what happened to them after that. Records would have been sealed. Ewan leaned against the counter processing this. Calvin and Irene hadn't just lost their farm, they'd lost their lives. And somewhere, their children had grown up without parents, without answers, probably without ever knowing the truth about what had been done to their family. Was it really an accident? He asked. Beverly's silence was answer enough. The sheriff back then was Lockhart's cousin, she finally said. The investigation into the crash was brief. Very brief. No one asked hard questions. She looked at the photographs again. If what you found is real, if Calvin Ashcroft documented everything, this could reopen a lot of old wounds. Good, Ewan said. Some wounds should never have been allowed to heal in the first place. Beverly studied him with an expression that might have been approval. What are you planning to do? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out what really happened. And if there's anyone left from the Ashcroft family, they deserve to know the truth. Be careful, Beverly warned. Harrison Lockhart died in 1995, but his son Preston runs half this county now. He owns the bank, sits on every board that matters, and has connections all the way to the state capital. If you start asking questions about his father's business dealings, let him try to stop me, Ewan said. I've got nothing left to lose. That wasn't entirely true anymore, and he realized it as he said it. 3 weeks ago it would have been accurate, but now he had something, purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just going through motions. Beverly glanced at the door again, then quickly made copies of several documents from the official files. She handed them to Ewan in a manila envelope. These are public records. Anyone can request them. But if anyone asks, you made the request yourself, and I was just doing my job. Thank you, Ewan said. One more thing. She wrote a name and phone number on a slip of paper. This is Father Patrick Bowen. He's been the priest at St. Michael's for 30 years, but before that, he was a young associate pastor in 1974. He knew the Ashcrofts. If anyone can tell you more about what happened, it's him. Ewan took the paper and shook her hand. I appreciate this, really. Just be careful, she said again. The past has sharp edges. Sometimes it cuts the people who dig it up. Back at the farm, Ewan spread everything across the kitchen table. Calvin's journals, the photographs of altered documents, the official records Beverly had copied. He was beginning to see the shape of what had happened, but there were still gaps, questions that needed answers. His phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. "Mr. MacAllister?" A woman's voice, young and uncertain. "This is Iris, his daughter." They hadn't spoken in 2 weeks. "Hey, sweetheart. Everything okay?" "I guess. You sound different. When we talked last week, you sounded more like yourself. I wanted to make sure you were still doing okay." Ewan looked at the documents spread across his table, at Calvin Ashcroft's handwriting in the journal, at the photograph of a family that had lost everything. "I'm doing better than I have in a long time," he said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "I found something. A mystery, I guess. It's been giving me something to focus on." "What kind of mystery?" He told her about the journal, about the Ashcroft family, about what he was learning. As he talked, he could hear the shift in her voice, curiosity replacing the careful distance she'd maintained for months. "That's terrible," Iris said when he finished. "Those poor people. Do you think you can find out what happened to the kids?" "I'm going to try." There was a pause. "Then, Dad, I'm glad you found something that matters to you again." The words lodged in his throat. "Me too, kiddo." After they hung up, Ewan sat for a long moment, Catherine's ring heavy on the chain around his neck. For 2 years, he'd been so consumed by grief that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care about something beyond his own pain. But Calvin Ashcroft's story had broken through that fog somehow, maybe because it wasn't really Calvin's story. It was the story of what happens when good people stay silent while injustice unfolds in front of them. It was about systems built to protect the powerful and crush everyone else. It was about the cost of not fighting back. Ewan knew those costs intimately. He'd paid them in his own life, the business he'd let fail, the grief he'd let consume him, the daughter who'd learned that her father gave up when things got hard. But maybe it wasn't too late to show her something different. He opened Calvin's journal again and read the final incomplete sentence. If anyone finds this, Ewan thought, they should finish what you started outside. The sun was setting, painting the barn in shades of gold and amber. Tomorrow he'd visit Father Bowen. Tomorrow he'd keep digging. Tonight he'd honor Calvin's memory by reading his words and remembering that some debts transcend time. St. Michael's Catholic Church sat on Thornfield's main street, a modest stone building with a white steeple that had weathered 50 Montana winters. Ewan found Father Patrick Bowen in the parish office, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the sort of gentle manner that made people trust him with their secrets. "Beverly Strand called ahead," Father Bowen said, gesturing for Ewan to sit. "Said you had questions about the Ashcroft family." "I found something at the farm," Ewan said. He pulled the family photograph from his jacket and laid it on the desk between them. "I thought you might remember them." Father Bowen picked up the photograph, and his entire demeanor shifted. His shoulders sagged slightly, and something that looked like old grief passed across his face. "I was a young priest then, 28 years old, fresh from the seminary, full of idealism about serving God and helping people." He touched Calvin's face in the photograph. "The Ashcrofts taught me that sometimes faith and justice aren't enough against human cruelty. What happened to them?" Father Bowen set the photograph down carefully. Calvin was a good man, hard-working, devoted to his family, active in the parish. Irene sang in the choir. The children came to Sunday school every week. They were the kind of family that makes a community stronger just by being part of it. He paused. "And then Harrison Lockhart destroyed them." Beverly said there were other families, 6 that I knew of, probably more that kept quiet. Father Bowen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. Lockhart had a system. He'd identify struggling farmers, people hit by drought or bad crops or medical bills. He'd offer them loans at rates that seemed reasonable compared to the banks. But the contracts were rigged. Hidden clauses, adjustable rates, balloon payments. Once they signed, they were trapped, and no one stopped him. The church tried. I went to the sheriff myself when the Ashcrofts were facing foreclosure. He told me to mind my own business. I went to the county judge. He was Lockhart's cousin. I even wrote to the state attorney general, and my letter was never answered. Father Bowen turned back to Ewan. That's when I learned that corruption isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a network of people protecting each other's interests while good families lose everything. Ewan thought of Calvin's journal, the desperation in those final entries. Did you see them before they left? The night before the foreclosure was finalized, Calvin came to the church. It was late, almost midnight. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. He asked me to pray with him, and we did. Then he asked me a question I've never forgotten. Father Bowen's voice grew quieter. He asked if God would forgive him for considering violence against Harrison Lockhart. The words hung in the air between them. What did you tell him? I told him that violence would only destroy what was left of his family, that his children needed him whole, not broken by rage and guilt, that the best revenge would be to survive, to rebuild, to refuse to let Lockhart take his soul along with his land. Father Bowen's expression was haunted. He thanked me and he left. 2 weeks later, he and Irene were dead on Highway 12. You don't think it was an accident. I think it happened 2 days after Calvin told me he had copies of documents that could prove what Lockhart had done. I think it happened on a stretch of road that wasn't particularly dangerous. And I think the investigation was concluded in less than 48 hours, with no meaningful questions asked. Father Bowen met Ewan's eyes. But I can't prove anything. All I have is 40 years of wondering if I could have done more. Ewan pulled out his phone and showed Father Bowen the photographs of Calvin's documents. He did make copies. He buried them under the barn floor. I found them 3 days ago. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he looked through the images. Lord have mercy. He preserved everything. I need to find David and Anne, Ewan said. Calvin's children. They deserve to know the truth. Anne would be, 59 now? David would be 62. Father Bowen thought for a moment. After their parents died, they were placed with a foster family in Billings. The church helped coordinate it. We wanted to keep them together if possible. I lost track of them after that. Child Services sealed the records. Do you remember the foster family's name? Morrison. The Morrisons. Father Bowen wrote it down. They were kind people. I hope the children had a good life with them. Ewan stood to leave, then hesitated. Why are you helping me? Beverly warned me that digging this up would make people uncomfortable. Because I've carried the weight of my silence for 40 years, Father Bowen said simply. Because every Sunday I stand at that altar and preach about truth and justice, and I know I failed the Ashcrofts when they needed someone to stand with them. If there's a chance to make that right even now, then I'll take it. Back at the farm, Ewan began the painstaking work of searching for Anne Ashcroft. The Morrison family in Billings was a starting point, but it had been 50 years. He called information, searched online directories, found 3 different families with that name in Billings. On his 4th call, an elderly woman answered. When Ewan explained why he was calling, there was a long silence. I remember those children, she said finally. Sweet kids, traumatized by what they'd been through. We kept them for 2 years before Anne was adopted by a family in Oregon. David stayed with us until he aged out of the system. Do you know where Anne went? The adoptive family's name was Grayson. They lived in Portland. That's all I know. Ewan thanked her and ended the call. And Grayson in Portland, Oregon. It wasn't much, but it was something. He spent the next 3 hours searching online databases, social media, public records. There were dozens of Anne Graysons in Oregon, but one of them, living in a suburb outside Portland, was the right age. Her profile picture showed a woman with graying hair and familiar eyes that matched the little girl in Calvin's photograph. Ewan drafted a letter carefully. He explained who he was, what he'd found, and why he thought she deserved to know. He included a copy of the photograph of her family standing in front of the barn. "Your father left a record of what happened," he wrote. "He wanted the truth to be known. I don't know if you'll want to hear this after all these years, but I believe you have a right to know that your parents fought for you. They didn't give up. They were taken from you." He mailed the letter the next morning and tried not to think about whether she'd respond. 3 weeks was a long time to wait for an answer that might never come. In the meantime, he threw himself into repairing the farm. Every board he replaced, every nail he drove, felt like an act of remembrance for Calvin. The work was honest and straightforward, the kind of labor that let his mind wander while his hands stayed busy. Sterling stopped by regularly now, offering advice and occasionally a thermos of coffee. The old farmer didn't ask many questions about Ewan's investigation, but one afternoon, as they were reinforcing the barn's foundation, he spoke up. "I was 35 when the Ashcrofts lost their farm," Sterling said. "Young enough to fight, old enough to know better. And I did nothing." Ewan looked at him. "You couldn't have stopped it." "Maybe not. But I could have tried. Could have stood witness. Could have made sure people knew what was happening instead of looking the other way." Sterling drove a post into the ground with more force than necessary. "You start telling yourself that it's not your problem, that you've got your own family to worry about, that someone else will step up. And then one day you wake up and realize you've spent your whole life being a coward. You're helping now," Ewan said. "Now's 50 years too late for the Ashcrofts." "But maybe," Sterling paused, choosing his words, "maybe it matters that someone finally cares enough to ask questions. Maybe that's worth something." That evening, Ewan called Iris. They'd been talking more frequently now, their conversations easier than they'd been in years. She'd become invested in the mystery of the Ashcroft family, doing her own research online, helping him track down leads. "I found something," she said as soon as she answered. "An obituary for David Ashcroft. He died in 1998 in Seattle. It says he was survived by his sister, Ann Grayson, of Portland, Oregon. So she's alive," Ewan said, relief washing through him. "That's good. I sent her a letter last week. Haven't heard back yet. Give her time, Dad. This is going to be huge for her. Finding out after all these years what really happened to her parents." They talked for another hour, and when Ewan hung up, he realized something had shifted between them. The distance that had felt insurmountable 6 months ago was closing. His daughter was seeing him as someone who cared about something beyond his own grief, someone who was willing to fight for what was right. It made him think of Catherine, of how proud she would have been. Not of the investigation itself, but of the fact that he'd found a way back to living. 3 weeks after he'd mailed the letter, Ewan's phone rang with an unfamiliar Oregon number. "Is this Ewan MacAllister?" A woman's voice, trembling slightly. "Yes. This is Ann Grayson. I got your letter." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice broke. "I need to see the farm. I need to see where they lived. Can I come? Visit?" Ewan looked around at the farmhouse he'd been working to restore, at Calvin's journal on the table, at the barn visible through the window. "Yes," he said, "you can come home." Ann Grayson arrived on a Saturday morning in October, when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first real bite of winter. Ewan watched from the porch as a rental car came up the long driveway, his heart beating faster than it should. When she stepped out of the car, he saw Calvin Ashcroft's eyes looking back at him across 50 years. Anne was 59 now, her hair more grey than brown, but she had her father's steady gaze and her mother's delicate features. A man emerged from the passenger side, tall, silver-haired, with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling difficult situations. "Mr. MacAllister." Anne's voice was controlled, but Ewan could see her hands shaking. "I'm Anne. This is my husband, Trevor. Call me Ewan." He came down the porch steps and shook both their hands. "Thank you for coming. I know this can't be easy." Anne wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes had fixed on the barn, and tears were already streaming down her face. "I remember that," she whispered. "I remember playing in front of it. There was a rope swing, right there, on that beam. The beam was gone now, rotted away decades ago, but Ewan could picture it. A little girl with pigtails, laughing as she swung through the summer air while her parents watched. "Would you like to look around?" he asked gently. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Trevor took her hand, and together they walked toward the barn. Ewan and Rook followed at a respectful distance. Anne moved through the space like she was walking through a dream. She touched the wooden walls, ran her fingers along the windowsill, stood in the center, and turned slowly, taking it all in. "I was 9 years old the last time I was here. It was November and it was cold. My mother was crying. My father kept saying we'd be okay, that we'd find another place, but I could hear in his voice that he didn't believe it. 'I'm sorry,' Ewan said, because there was nothing else adequate to say. We left in the middle of the night. My father packed our truck while my mother held me and David. I didn't understand why we had to leave. I thought we'd done something wrong." Anne's voice broke. 2 weeks later, a social worker came to tell us our parents were dead. They said it was a car accident. They said it was quick, that they didn't suffer. I believed that for 50 years. Trevor put his arm around her shoulders. "Maybe we should sit down. This is a lot." They moved to the farmhouse, where Ewan had cleaned and arranged everything as best he could. He'd set up folding chairs around the kitchen table, made coffee, tried to make the space welcoming. On the table sat Calvin's journal and the metal box containing all the documents. Anne sat down slowly, staring at the journal like it might bite her. "Is that my father's handwriting?" "Yes." Ewan pushed it toward her carefully. "He wrote about your family, about building this place, about how much he loved you and your brother. He also wrote about what Harrison Lockhart did to you." Anne opened the journal with trembling hands. For the next hour, she read while Trevor sat beside her and Ewan gave her space. He watched emotions play across her face, joy at the early entries, pain as the tone darkened, rage when she reached the parts about Lockhart's manipulation. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but clear. "I never knew. I knew we'd lost the farm, but I thought it was just bad luck, bad crops, bad timing. No one ever told me my father was fighting against someone who'd rigged the system against us." "He documented everything," Ewan said. He spread out the photographs of the altered documents, the loan agreements, the evidence of fraud. He knew what was being done to him, and he made sure there was a record of it. He buried it under the barn floor, wrapped in oilcloth. "I think he hoped someone would find it someday." Trevor leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts engaged. He studied the documents carefully, making notes on a legal pad he'd brought. After 20 minutes, he looked up. "This is solid evidence of fraud. Multiple instances of contract manipulation, forgery, conspiracy. If these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, this is criminal activity." 50 years ago, Anne said bitterly. "What difference does it make now?" "It makes a difference to the truth," Ewan said. "It makes a difference to your father's memory, and it might make a difference legally, depending on the statute of limitations." Trevor nodded slowly. "Montana has no statute of limitations on fraud in some cases, especially when it involves property and concealment of evidence. And there's another issue. If your parents' death wasn't an accident, if it was connected to their fight against Lockhart, then we're potentially looking at wrongful death. That changes everything." Anne's hands clenched on the journal. "Do you think he killed them, Harrison Lockhart?" "I think it's suspicious that they died 2 weeks after being forced off their land, days after your father told a priest he had evidence against Lockhart," Ewan said. "I think the investigation was rushed and inadequate. I think there are questions that were never asked." "Harrison Lockhart is dead," Trevor said. "Died in 1995. But his son Preston runs the family business empire now. If we pursue this, we'd be going after him, both for his father's crimes and potentially for benefiting from those crimes." Anne was quiet for a long time, staring at the journal. Finally she spoke. "I need to tell you about David, my brother." Her voice was steady now, resolved. "He struggled his whole life. Depression, addiction, rage he couldn't explain. He died at 46 of a drug overdose. Before he died, he told me that he blamed himself for not protecting our parents. He was 12 years old when we lost the farm, and he spent his entire adult life feeling like he'd failed them. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. If people knew the truth, if they knew our parents were victims, not failures, maybe David's story would be different. Maybe other people's stories would be different. How many families did Lockhart destroy? How many children grew up thinking their parents just weren't good enough? At least 6 families that Beverly Strand knows about, Ewan said. Probably more. Anne looked at her husband. I want to pursue this. I want people to know what was done to my family. Trevor squeezed her hand. It won't be easy. Preston Lockhart is powerful. He has resources, connections, lawyers. Going after him means making an enemy of one of the most influential men in the county. I don't care, Anne said. My parents deserve justice. David deserves people to know he didn't fail, that the system failed all of us. She turned to Ewan. Why are you doing this? You didn't know my family. This isn't your fight. Ewan thought about how to answer that. He could talk about finding purpose after Catherine's death, about needing something to care about beyond his own grief. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. Your father left a message, he said finally. The last line in his journal was incomplete. If anyone finds this, I think he was trying to say that whoever found it should do something with it, should tell the story, should make sure the truth came out. He paused. I found it, so I guess that makes it my responsibility. Anne reached across the table and took his hand. Thank you for caring, for digging, for finding me. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through everything. The documents, the photographs, the journal entries. Trevor took detailed notes, photographed everything, began building a timeline of events. Anne shared her memories of that final year, filling in gaps that the documents couldn't. She told them about her father working 2 jobs, about her mother, selling vegetables at the farmer's market, about the tension that filled their small house. She remembered Harrison Lockhart visiting once, a tall man in an expensive suit who smiled at her but had cold eyes. She remembered her father's face after Lockhart left, defeated in a way she'd never seen before. After they died, the Foster families were kind, Anne said. The Morrisons tried their best, but I lost everything that night. My parents, my brother eventually, my history. I grew up not knowing where I came from or what my parents had fought for. I made a life for myself, but there was always this empty space at the center of it. She looked around the kitchen, at the farmhouse her parents had lived in, and something in her expression shifted. This place, it's not just property. It's proof that they existed, that they tried, that they mattered. Thank you for taking care of it. I've been fixing it up, Ewan said, trying to restore what your father built. He'd appreciate that. Anne smiled through her tears. He believed in building things that lasted, things that meant something. As the sun began to set, painting the fields in shades of amber and gold, they stood together on the porch. Anne looked out at the land her parents had loved, the barn her father had built, the horizon her mother had watched while planning her garden. I want to fight this, she said quietly. I want Preston Lockhart to answer for what his father did. But more than that, I want people to know my parents' story. I want their names cleared. I want David's memory honored. Then that's what we'll do, Ewan said. Trevor cleared his throat. I should mention, I'm retired now, but I practiced law for 30 years. Estate law, mostly, but I know my way around a courtroom. If you want to pursue this legally, I'll help. Pro bono. Ewan felt something shift in his chest, the weight of isolation lifting, replaced by the strength of shared purpose. He wasn't alone in this anymore. They were building something together, the 3 of them, a coalition of people who believed that truth mattered, that justice was worth fighting for even decades late. As Anne and Trevor prepared to leave, promising to return in a few weeks with a plan, Anne stopped at the door. Can I take the journal? I'd like to read the rest of it. Hear my father's voice again. Of course, Ewan said. It belongs to you. She held it carefully like the precious thing it was. You know what's strange? I came here dreading what I'd feel. But standing on this land, being in this house, I don't feel sad. I feel connected. Like I finally understand where I came from. After they left, Ewan stood on the porch with Rook beside him, watching the taillights disappear down the long driveway. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about Anne's words. I finally understand where I came from. Maybe that was what all of this was about. Not just justice for the Ashcrofts, but understanding how good people could be destroyed by systems designed to protect the powerful. Understanding how silence enabled evil. Understanding that healing required truth, no matter how painful. And understanding, finally, that his own grief didn't have to be the end of his story. It could be the beginning of something else, something that mattered beyond himself. Inside, he looked at the empty spot on the table where the journal had been. Tomorrow, he'd start planning the next steps. Tomorrow, he'd continue the fight. Tonight, he'd simply honor what had begun. A connection across time between two men who'd both learned that sometimes the only way forward was to stand and fight, even when the odds seemed impossible. The weeks following Anne's visit transformed the farm from Ewan's solitary refuge into something else entirely. A headquarters, a memorial, a place where the past and present collided. Trevor returned twice, bringing file boxes and legal pads, turning the kitchen table into a war room for their investigation. Iris came for a long weekend, her first visit to the farm. Ewan watched nervously as she walked through the property, worried she'd see only the decay and isolation that had drawn him here. Instead, she surprised him. It's peaceful, she said, standing in the barn doorway. I can see why someone would want to build a life here. They worked together that weekend, cataloging documents, scanning everything into digital files, building a timeline of the Ashcroft family's final year. Iris had inherited her mother's methodical mind, and she organized the evidence with a precision that impressed even Trevor. You're good at this, Ewan told her as she cross-referenced bank records with journal entries. I've been thinking about law school, Iris said, not looking up from her work. Seeing what you're doing here, fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, it matters. I want to do something that matters. Ewan felt Catherine's presence then, a warmth in his chest that might have been pride or grief or both. Their daughter had been adrift for so long after losing her mother, and now she was finding direction. Not despite his investigation, but because of it. Sterling visited more frequently too, bringing not just coffee, but stories. He'd begun talking to other older residents of Thornfield, people who remembered the Ashcroft family and the other farms that had been lost. One afternoon he arrived with a man Ewan hadn't met before. This is Vernon Walsh, Sterling said. He farmed the property north of here until 1973. Lost it the same way Calvin did. Vernon was 81, bent with arthritis, but sharp-eyed. He shook Ewan's hand with surprising strength. Sterling says you're looking into what Lockhart did. About time someone asked questions. Over coffee, Vernon told his story. It was eerily similar to Calvin's. The initial loan at reasonable rates, the hidden clauses that kicked in after 6 months, the impossible payments, the foreclosure that seemed preordained. I tried to fight it, Vernon said. Hired a lawyer from Billings. But every judge in the county was in Lockhart's pocket. I lost everything, the farm, my savings, my marriage. Wife couldn't take the shame of it. Left me and took our daughter. Would you be willing to testify about what happened? Ewan asked. Vernon didn't hesitate. I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask. More people came forward once word spread that someone was finally investigating the Lockhart family. A woman named Constance Briggs, whose father had lost his ranch in 1972. A man named Albert Yates, who'd witnessed documents being altered at the county office. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, another voice to what was becoming a chorus of suppressed truth. Father Bowen facilitated many of these meetings, quietly reaching out to parishioners he knew had been affected. One evening, he brought someone unexpected, an elderly woman named Pauline Strand, Beverly's mother. I worked as a secretary for the county attorney in the 70s. Pauline said. Her voice was thin with age but steady. I typed up foreclosure notices. I saw things that weren't right. Dates that didn't match. Signatures that looked copied. When I asked questions, I was told to mind my business or find another job. I had 3 kids to feed, so I stayed quiet." She looked at Ewan with watery eyes. "I've regretted that silence every day since." Trevor recorded all the testimonies, his legal mind cataloguing each piece of evidence, building the framework of a case. One night after everyone had left, he sat with Ewan on the porch and outlined their options. "We have enough to file a civil suit against Preston Lockhart," Trevor said. "Fraud, unjust enrichment, conspiracy. We can argue that he's benefited from his father's criminal activity and should be required to make restitution to the families affected." "Will it work?" Ewan asked. "Legally? Maybe. The evidence is strong, but it's old." "Lockhart will have expensive lawyers who will fight every step." Trevor paused. "But there's another option. We go public first. Get media attention, tell the story before the lawyers can bury it in procedural motions. Force the truth into daylight where it can't be hidden. That's riskier," Ewan said. "For you, yes. You'll be the face of this. They'll come after your credibility, your motives, everything." Trevor looked at him seriously. "Are you prepared for that?" Ewan thought about Catherine, about the years he'd spent hiding from life after she died. He thought about Calvin Ashcroft, who'd fought alone and lost everything. But this time was different. This time, there were witnesses willing to speak. This time there was proof. "I'm ready," Ewan said. The pushback began subtly. A week later, Beatrice stopped by the farm looking troubled. "I've been hearing things in town," she said. "Questions about why you're stirring up old history. Some people aren't happy." "What kind of people?" "The kind whose families have connections to the Lockharts. The kind who benefit from not asking hard questions." She hesitated. "Someone came into my office yesterday asking about your purchase of this property. Wanted to know if there were any irregularities in the sale, anything that could be challenged." "Let them try," Ewan said. "The sale was legal. That's not the point. They're looking for leverage. Ways to discredit you or make your life difficult." Beatrice's concern was genuine. "Be careful, Ewan. The Lockharts don't like being challenged." That night, Ewan found a letter tucked into his truck's windshield. The message was brief and unsigned. "Some history is better left buried. Stop asking questions." He showed it to Sterling the next morning. The old farmer's jaw tightened. "That's how it starts. First they warn you, then they escalate. What did they do to you when you didn't stay quiet?" "I did stay quiet," Sterling said, the words heavy with regret. "That's what I've had to live with. But you don't have to make the same mistake. You've got people standing with you now. That makes all the difference." He was right. Within days, Sterling had organized a group of older residents, people who remembered what had happened and were finally ready to speak up. They met at the farm one Saturday morning, a dozen men and women who'd spent decades carrying the weight of their silence. "We should have done this 40 years ago," Vernon said to the group. "But we were afraid. Afraid of losing what little we had left, afraid of being ostracized, afraid of Lockhart's power." He looked around at the others. "But I'm 81 years old. I'm done being afraid," the others nodded, their faces showing the same determination. These were people who'd learned to live with compromise, with looking the other way, with small moral failures that had accumulated over decades. Now they were choosing something different. Father Bowen led them in a prayer, not for success, but for courage to tell the truth regardless of consequences. It was one of the most moving things Ewan had ever witnessed. As the meeting broke up, Anne called. She and Trevor had been working with an investigative journalist named Bryn Hadley, who specialized in corruption stories. "She's interested," Anne said, excitement clear in her voice. "She wants to come to Thornfield, interview everyone, see the documents. If she writes the story, it'll reach millions of people." "When?" Ewan asked. 2 weeks. She needs time to verify everything independently. But she thinks this is huge. Not just about what happened to my family, but about systemic corruption and how communities stay silent when they should speak up. After hanging up, Ewan walked out to the barn. It was late afternoon, the light slanting through the missing boards in the roof, illuminating dust motes that drifted like gold. This was where it had all started. Rook barking at the floorboards, leading him to a box buried by a desperate man who'd hoped someone would care enough to dig. Calvin's childhood drawing that Anne had left with him hung on the barn wall now, protected in a simple frame. It showed the farmhouse and barn rendered in crayon, with stick figures representing a family. Simple, innocent, full of the kind of hope that should never be crushed. Ewan understood now what Calvin had been trying to preserve. Not just evidence of crime, but proof that he'd fought back. That he hadn't surrendered quietly. That his life and his family's suffering had meant something. The difference was that Calvin had fought alone, and Ewan wasn't alone anymore. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Rook beside him, he called Iris. "How would you feel about taking a semester off school to help with this?" he asked. "I know it's a lot to ask, but—" "Yes," she interrupted. "I've already talked to Aunt Patricia about it. If we're really doing this, if we're going after Preston Lockhart and exposing what his father did, then I want to be part of it." "It might get ugly," Ewan warned. "Good," Iris said fiercely. "Sometimes things need to get ugly before they can get better. You taught me that, Dad, by doing this." After they hung up, Ewan sat in the gathering darkness and felt the weight of what they were building. A coalition of witnesses, a collection of evidence that couldn't be denied, a story that demanded to be told. Somewhere in Thornfield, Preston Lockhart probably knew by now that someone was asking questions about his father's business dealings. He'd be preparing his defense, marshalling his resources, getting ready to fight. Let him, Ewan thought. Because this time, the people he'd wronged weren't staying silent. This time, they were standing together. This time, the truth was coming out whether Preston Lockhart liked it or not. Rook shifted closer, and Ewan rested his hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he said quietly. "None of this happens without you finding that box." The stars were emerging now, sharp and bright in the Montana sky. Somewhere up there, maybe Calvin and Irene Ashcroft were watching. Maybe they knew that their story was finally being heard. Ewan hoped so. He hoped they knew that their fight hadn't been forgotten, that their children, the ones who survived and the one who didn't, would finally have the truth, and that sometimes justice takes 50 years, but it comes anyway. Ewan was reinforcing the barn's foundation when he found it. The work was tedious, but necessary. Removing loose stones from the base, checking for structural damage, resetting everything properly. He'd been at it for 3 hours when his crowbar hit something that wasn't stone. He stopped, his heart suddenly racing. Pulled away more rocks. Behind them, wedged into a gap in the foundation itself, was another oilcloth package. Rook, who'd been dozing in a patch of sunlight, lifted his head and whined. "Yeah, boy," Ewan said quietly. "I feel it too." This package was smaller than the first, but when Ewan unwrapped it, he found another journal. Same leather binding as Calvin's first, same careful handwriting. But the tone was different from the first word. The first entry was dated October 28th, 1974, 3 weeks before the foreclosure. "If something happens to me, this tells the whole truth." Ewan sat down right there on the dirt floor of the barn and began to read. What Calvin had documented in this second journal made the first look like a gentle introduction. This was a man who knew he was in danger, who was racing against time to record everything before it was too late. Calvin detailed meetings he'd witnessed, conversations he'd overheard, connections he'd uncovered. Harrison Lockhart wasn't working alone. He was the front man for something much larger. A network of investors, politicians, and businessmen who'd identified properties with water rights or potential mineral deposits. They'd created a systematic approach to acquiring them, identify struggling owners, offer deceptive loans, foreclose when payments became impossible, consolidate the land. The scope was staggering. Calvin listed names: county commissioners, state legislators, a judge, the president of the Regional Bank Association. He documented meetings at the Lockhart estate where these men gathered to divide up properties like generals planning a campaign. November 2nd, 1974. I followed Lockhart's car to the state capitol last night. He met with 3 men at the governor's mansion. One of them was State Senator Richard Granger, the same man who's been pushing legislation to privatize water rights. I'm beginning to understand what this is really about. The farms they're taking aren't random. They're all on the watershed that feeds into what would become the reservoir for the proposed development project. They're not just stealing land. They're stealing water. Ewan's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about the Ashcrofts or even the 6 families they'd already documented. This was organized corruption on a scale that would have destroyed dozens of families, enriched the conspirators by millions, and reshaped the entire region's development. November 8th, 1974. I've made copies of everything. Not just the loan documents, but photographs of the planning maps I saw in Lockhart's study. Lists of properties targeted, projections of profits. I broke into his office, God forgive me, but I needed proof. What I found is worse than I imagined. They're planning to dam the watershed, flood several valleys, force out everyone who lives there. All under the guise of regional development. The people who'll profit are the same ones orchestrating the foreclosures. Calvin had included names that made Ewan's blood run cold. Several were dead now, but others were still alive. State legislators who'd gone on to higher office, business leaders who'd built empires, and one name that kept appearing, the father of Montana's current governor, November 12, 1974. I went to a lawyer in Helena, someone with no connections to Lockhart. He looked at my evidence and told me I had enough to blow this whole conspiracy open. But he also told me I was in danger. These aren't people who let obstacles stand in their way. He advised me to go to the FBI, to the state attorney general. Said I should do it quickly and make sure lots of people knew what I had before I did. The next entry was dated November 14th. Irene is terrified. She wants us to leave, to run, to forget about all of this. The children don't understand why I keep working on these documents instead of preparing to move. But I can't let this go. If I don't speak up, no one will. Someone has to stand against this, even if I'm the only one. November 15th. I'm making multiple copies of everything, hiding them in different locations. One set goes with the original journal under the barn floor. This journal and the photographs go into the foundation. I'm sending a third set to a contact at the Montana Standard newspaper, though I'm not sure they'll publish it. Lockhart's influence reaches far, but I have to try. The final entry was dated November 17th, 1974, the day before the foreclosure was finalized. Tomorrow, we lose everything, but they won't get away with it, not forever. I've left a trail of evidence that can't all be erased. Someday, someone will find it. Someday, the truth will come out. I just hope it's soon enough to save other families from what happened to us. To whoever finds this, you have everything you need to expose them. All of them. Please don't let our sacrifice be for nothing. Below the writing was a list of locations where Calvin had hidden additional evidence. The barn foundation, the base of an old cottonwood tree on the property's eastern boundary. Inside a false bottom in a desk he'd planned to move before the foreclosure. Ewan sat in the barn for a long time, processing what he'd read. They hadn't just uncovered a crime against one family. They'd uncovered a conspiracy that had operated at the state level, that had potentially affected dozens of properties and hundreds of lives, and if Calvin's death hadn't been an accident, if someone had killed him to silence him, then Ewan had just found evidence of murder. He called Trevor immediately. "You need to come back here," Ewan said. "I found something else, something that changes everything." 2 days later, the farm was filled with people again. Trevor and Anne had driven through the night. Iris had taken an early flight from Billings. Sterling stood guard at the driveway, making sure no one unexpected showed up. They gathered around the kitchen table as Ewan presented the second journal. He watched their faces as they read, shock giving way to outrage, outrage giving way to grim determination. "This is massive," Trevor said, his lawyer's composure cracking. "We're not talking about isolated fraud anymore. This is RICO territory, racketeering, conspiracy, corruption at multiple levels of government. Some of these people are still alive," Anne said, her voice shaking. "Still in positions of power, still benefiting from what they did." Iris was scrolling through her laptop, cross-referencing names. "The current governor's father is on this list. Senator Granger served in the state legislature for 30 years before retiring in 2005. Preston Lockhart sits on the boards of 4 different state commissions. She looked up. If we go public with this, we're not just fighting Preston Lockhart. We're fighting a network of people who've spent 50 years protecting each other. Then we'd better make sure we do it right, Ewan said. Trevor pulled out his phone and called Bryn Hadley, the investigative journalist. She answered on the second ring, and Trevor put her on speaker. "I'm sending you photographs of documents we just found," Trevor said. "You need to see this before you come out here. It's bigger than we thought." There was silence on the other end as Bryn reviewed the images. When she spoke again, her voice was different, sharper, more focused. "This is Pulitzer material, but it's also dangerous. You understand that, right? These aren't just rich people who'll be embarrassed. These are connected people who've spent decades building power structures. They will fight this with everything they have." "We know," Anne said. "But we're going to tell the story anyway." "Then I'm in," Bryn said. "But we need to be smart about this. We verify everything independently. We make copies of copies. We make sure this information is distributed widely enough that it can't be suppressed. And we go public all at once. No warning, no chance for them to get ahead of it. Over the next week they worked systematically. Trevor made copies of everything and distributed them to multiple lawyers in different states. Bryn began her investigation, interviewing witnesses, cross-referencing Calvin's claims with public records, building an airtight story. Iris created a digital archive, uploading everything to secure cloud storage with multiple access points. Ewan and Sterling searched the property for Calvin's other hidden caches. They found the evidence at the base of the cottonwood tree, more photographs, more documents, lists of payments between conspirators. The desk was long gone, probably discarded during one of the property's subsequent ownership changes, but what they had was enough. More than enough. Father Bowen came by one evening and sat with Ewan on the porch. "You know what's about to happen," the priest said quietly. "Once this story breaks, there's no going back. Your life will change. This farm will become famous or infamous. You'll have supporters and enemies, attention you never wanted." "I know," Ewan said. "Is it worth it?" Ewan thought about Calvin Ashcroft, working alone in the darkness to document crimes he couldn't stop. He thought about Anne, who'd spent 50 years not knowing why her childhood had been destroyed. He thought about David, who died thinking his parents had failed. "Yes," he said, "it's worth it." 2 weeks later, Bryn called with news. "The story is ready. My editor wants to run it Sunday front page, with a simultaneous online release. We're also sending advance copies to the FBI and the State Attorney General. By Monday morning, everyone in Montana will know what happened." That night, Ewan stood in the barn where it had all begun. Rook sat beside him, grey muzzle resting on Ewan's knee. The old dog had been with him through everything: Catherine's death, the move to the farm, the discovery that had changed everything. "We did it, boy," Ewan said quietly. "We're finishing what Calvin started. Tomorrow the truth would come out. Tomorrow, 50 years of silence would end. And whatever came after, whatever consequences, whatever battles, Ewan was ready. The days before publication felt like holding your breath underwater. Ewan knew the story was coming, knew it would change everything. But the waiting stretched his nerves thin. Bryn arrived in Thornfield 3 days before the story would run, bringing a photographer and a fact-checker. They spent hours at the farm, photographing the barn, the journals, the documents. The photographer took a portrait of Ewan, standing in front of the farmhouse, Rook at his side, and Ewan felt exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. "This is going to put you in the spotlight," Bryn warned. "Are you prepared for that?" He wasn't sure anyone could be prepared for what was coming, but he nodded anyway. Anne and Trevor arrived that same afternoon, and wanted to be there when the story broke, wanted to stand on the land her parents had fought for when the truth finally came out. They set up in the farmhouse, which had become less like Ewan's home and more like a command center. Iris coordinated communication, fielding calls from additional witnesses who'd heard rumors that something big was coming. Vernon stopped by daily, along with other elderly residents who'd finally found the courage to speak. The house that had been empty for decades was now filled with voices, with purpose, with the energy of people who'd stopped running from the past. Sterling organized security, quietly enlisting farmers he trusted to keep watch on the property. Lockhart people have been asking questions in town, he explained, trying to figure out what you're up to. Better to be careful. The first real threat came 2 nights before publication. Ewan was alone at the farm. The others had gone into town for supplies when a black sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 men in expensive suits got out, moving with the calculated confidence of people used to getting what they wanted. Rook growled low in his throat. Ewan put a hand on the dog's collar and stepped out onto the porch. "Ewan MacAllister?" the taller man called. He had silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Gerald Briggs. I'm an attorney representing the Lockhart family interests. We'd like to speak with you about certain historical documents that may have come into your possession." "I'm not interested in talking," Ewan said. "Mr. Lockhart is prepared to be very generous," Briggs continued, ignoring the refusal. "He understands you've made considerable investments in this property. He's willing to purchase it from you at well above market value, let's say $300,000. That's quite a profit on a $400 investment. So that's how they wanted to play it. Buy him off, make the problem disappear. "The farm's not for sale," the second man spoke up, his voice colder. "Mr. MacAllister, you should know that raising baseless accusations against prominent citizens can have serious legal consequences. Defamation, harassment, trespassing, these are all issues we'd hate to pursue, but we will if necessary." "I haven't made any accusations," Ewan said calmly. "And I didn't trespass anywhere. Breaking into Harrison Lockhart's office in 1974 certainly qualifies," Briggs said. "We have reason to believe certain documents in your possession were obtained illegally. So they'd read Calvin's journal, or at least knew what was in it, which meant they were scared." "Calvin Ashcroft broke in," Ewan said. 50 years ago. I just found what he left behind. On my property. Property you purchased under potentially fraudulent circumstances," the second man said. "We're looking into the auction process. Irregularities in the bidding, failure to properly notify interested parties." "Get off my land," Ewan said quietly. Briggs's smile turned sharp. "You're making a mistake. Preston Lockhart is a reasonable man, but his patience has limits. Take the money, Mr. MacAllister. Walk away while you still can." I said, "Get off my land." The 2 men exchanged glances, then returned to their car. But before they drove away, Briggs rolled down his window. "You should think about your daughter. These kinds of investigations can be stressful for families. Would be a shame if she got caught up in legal troubles because of your poor judgment." Rage flooded through Ewan, but he kept his voice level. "If you go near my daughter, if you even look at her, I'll make sure every news outlet in the country knows you threatened a 16-year-old girl. Now get out!" The car pulled away, leaving Ewan shaking on the porch. When the others returned an hour later, he told them what had happened. Trevor's face darkened. "They're desperate." "That's good. It means they know the story is solid. But it also means they'll escalate." "Should we be worried?" Anne asked. "We should be careful," Trevor said. "But we don't stop. That's what they want." That night, Sterling and 3 other farmers showed up with sleeping bags. "We're staying," Sterling said simply. "Nobody's getting to you or this farm without going through us first." Ewan was moved beyond words. These men, most of them in their 70s, were putting themselves at risk for a fight that wasn't even theirs. Except it was theirs in a way. It was everyone's fight who'd ever been crushed by power and watched the powerful get away with it. The next day brought another development. Beverly from the county records office called, her voice tight with stress. "Someone broke into the records room last night. They didn't take anything, but they went through the files." "The Ashcroft files specifically. Did they take the originals?" Ewan asked. "No, I'd already made copies and stored the originals in a different location. But they know we have them." She paused. "Ewan, I'm scared. I've worked in that office for 22 years without incident, and now, do you want to back out?" Ewan asked gently. I'll understand if you do. There was a long silence. Then no, I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of watching powerful people hurt others and doing nothing about it. Whatever happens, I'm seeing this through. One by one, the witnesses reaffirmed their commitment. Vernon, despite his age and failing health. Pauline Strand, despite her daughter's fears. Constance Briggs, despite being threatened by the lawyer who shared her last name. Father Bowen, despite pressure from some of his wealthier parishioners. They were creating something Ewan hadn't expected, a community united not by proximity, but by conscience. People who'd spent decades living with their silence were choosing finally to speak. The day before publication, Bryn called with final confirmation. The story runs tomorrow morning. 6,000 words, front page, with an online interactive feature that includes scanned documents and video interviews. The FBI has been briefed. The State Attorney General has the evidence package. And we've got statements from 12 witnesses on the record. How are they spinning it? Trevor asked. 50 years of silence. How Montana families were destroyed by systematic corruption. We're framing it as both a historical investigation and a current scandal, since several people named in Calvin's journals are still alive and still influential. After the call, the group gathered on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the fields in gold. Tomorrow, everything would change. Their names would be public, their story told, the evidence exposed. I wish my parents could see this, Anne said quietly. I wish David could see it. Maybe they can, Father Bowen said. Maybe they're watching. Ewan thought about Catherine too, about how proud she would have been, not of the investigation itself, but of the man he'd become through it. The man who'd stopped hiding, stopped running, stopped letting grief define him. That night he barely slept. When dawn came, he stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun rise over the farm. Somewhere in newsrooms and homes across Montana, people were waking up to the truth. The fight was just beginning, but they'd already won something important. They'd refused to stay silent. They'd chosen to stand, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. The story broke at 6 in the morning. Ewan's phone started ringing before sunrise. Reporters from across the state, then the region, then national outlets. By 7, 3 news vans were parked at the end of his driveway. By 8, Thornfield's main street was crowded with journalists and camera crews. The headline was everything Bryn had promised. 50 years of silence, how Montana families were destroyed by systematic corruption. The article was comprehensive, devastating, impossible to dismiss. Calvin's journals were quoted extensively. The documents photographed and displayed. The network of conspirators mapped out with dates, names, and connections. The Ashcroft family photo ran above the fold. Calvin, Irene, David, and Anne standing in front of the barn, smiling at a future they'd never get to see. Beside it was a recent photo of Anne standing in the same spot, tears on her face, pointing to where her father had built their dreams. Ewan watched it unfold from the farmhouse porch. Rook pressed against his leg. Sterling stood beside him, reading the article on his phone with shaking hands. It's all here, the old farmer said, his voice thick. Everything we should have said 40 years ago. By 9, the response was explosive. Social media erupted with shares and outrage. The hashtag #DrewAshcroftTruth began trending statewide. People were calling for investigations, demanding accountability, sharing their own stories of being crushed by powerful interests. The State Attorney General issued a statement by 10. We are reviewing evidence related to potential criminal activity spanning multiple decades. A formal investigation will be opened immediately. The FBI released their own statement an hour later. We have received substantial documentation regarding allegations of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The matter is under active investigation. Anne gave her first interview at noon, standing in front of the barn with reporters surrounding her. Ewan watched from inside, seeing her transform from the grieving daughter into something else, a voice for every family that had been silenced. My parents didn't fail, she said, her voice steady and clear. They were victims of a system designed to destroy them. My brother spent his life carrying shame that was never his to carry. It's time everyone knows the truth about what was done to us and to so many others." The reporter asked about Preston Lockhart. Anne's expression hardened. He built his empire on stolen land and broken families. He's benefited his entire life from his father's crimes. It's time he answered for that. By early afternoon, Preston Lockhart called his own press conference. Ewan watched it on television with the others gathered in the farmhouse. Lockhart was 52, silver-haired and distinguished-looking in an expensive suit. His attorney stood beside him, along with two other men who looked like high-priced crisis managers. "These allegations are false and defamatory," Lockhart said, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying fury. "My father was a respected businessman who operated within the law. The claims made by Mr. MacAllister and others are based on forged documents and the fantasies of a man who died 50 years ago." A reporter shouted a question. "What about the 12 witnesses who've come forward?" "Disgruntled people looking for money," Lockhart's attorney answered smoothly. "We'll be filing defamation suits against everyone involved in this coordinated attack on my client's reputation." But the confident facade was cracking. Lockhart's bank was already seeing consequences. Customers withdrawing accounts, partners distancing themselves, board members quietly resigning. The story was too detailed, too well documented, too explosive to dismiss. By evening, the first resignation came. County Commissioner Andrew Marsh, whose father was named in Calvin's journals, announced he was stepping down to focus on family matters. 2 more officials followed within hours. The phones at the farm never stopped ringing. Supporters calling to offer help. Other victims calling to share their stories. Lawyers calling to offer representation. Iris managed the calls with remarkable composure, documenting everything, directing people to appropriate resources. Father Bowen arrived at sunset with news from town. St. Michael's was packed for evening service. Standing room only. People praying, crying, talking about what happened. This has opened something in Thornfield. 40 years of suppressed guilt and shame coming to the surface. That night, as darkness fell, the farm became a gathering place. Neighbors arrived with food, with stories, with solidarity. People who'd lost farms decades ago embraced and wept. Young people who'd never known the history stood in shock, learning what their town had hidden. Vernon stood in the barn where Calvin had buried his truth and spoke to the crowd. "We failed the Ashcrofts. We failed each other. But tonight we stand together and say no more. No more silence. No more looking away when the powerful crush the powerless." The response was thunderous applause and tears. Ewan found Anne standing apart from the crowd, looking at her childhood drawing on the barn wall. "They can't take this away from us," she said. "Not anymore. My parents' story is told. David's pain is understood. The truth is out." She turned to Ewan. "Thank you for caring when you didn't have to, for fighting when you could have walked away." "I couldn't walk away," Ewan said simply. "Your father wouldn't let me." As the crowd gathered outside began singing, someone had started Amazing Grace, and others had joined in. Ewan felt the weight of Catherine's ring on his chest. She would have loved this moment. The courage, the community, the commitment to what was right. The fight was far from over. Lockhart would counterattack. There would be legal battles, media warfare, attempts to discredit them. But tonight, they'd won something that couldn't be taken back. The truth was out, and it was spreading like wildfire across Montana. The arrests came on a cold Tuesday morning, 5 days after the story broke. Ewan was in the barn with Sterling when Iris ran out, phone in hand, breathless. "Turn on the news, now!" They crowded around the television in the farmhouse. The footage showed federal agents entering the Lockhart Bank headquarters in downtown Thornfield. Preston Lockhart was led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of shock and fury. The news anchor's voice was clinical. "Federal authorities have arrested Preston Lockhart on charges of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The charges stem from evidence that Lockhart knowingly benefited from his father's criminal activities and engaged in similar practices in recent years." Anne's hand flew to her mouth. Trevor pulled her close as tears streamed down her face. "Additional arrests are expected," the anchor continued. "Former County Commissioner Gerald Hawthorne and retired State Senator Richard Granger were taken into custody this morning. Sources indicate the investigation has expanded to include at least 7 other individuals connected to the conspiracy documented in Calvin Ashcroft's journals." The phone rang. It was Bryn. "Are you watching?" "Yes," Ewan said. "This is huge." The FBI found current evidence. Lockhart was still using similar schemes to acquire properties. 3 families in the last decade alone. Your investigation didn't just expose the past. It stopped ongoing crimes. After she hung up, the room erupted. People were crying, hugging, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. Vernon sat heavily in a chair, his weathered face showing 50 years of carried weight, finally lifting. "They arrested them," he kept repeating. "They actually arrested them." Father Bowen led them in prayer, his voice breaking with emotion. "For Calvin and Irene, for David, for every family that suffered in silence, for the courage to finally speak truth. We give thanks." The afternoon brought more news. Lockhart's bank was being placed into federal receivership. His assets were frozen pending investigation. Civil suits were being filed by multiple families, including Anne, who was suing for wrongful death and the return of the farm's value adjusted for 50 years of lost use. But the most profound moment came that evening. A convoy of vehicles arrived at the farm. Older couples, families, people Ewan had never met. They parked along the driveway and walked toward the farmhouse carrying photographs, documents, boxes of old papers. A woman in her 60s approached first. "My name is Patricia Whitmore. My father lost his ranch to Harrison Lockhart in 1973. I never knew why we left Montana until I read your story. I brought his papers, everything he saved. I want to add them to the record." Others followed. Children and grandchildren of the families Lockhart had destroyed, each carrying pieces of their history. Stories that had been buried for decades were emerging into light. Sterling organized them, creating a system to document everything. The barn became an archive, not just of the Ashcrofts' tragedy, but of a community's collective wound finally being acknowledged. Iris worked with Trevor to ensure everything was properly catalogued, photographed, preserved. "This isn't just evidence," she said. "This is history. This is making sure it never happens again." That night, Beatrice arrived with news from town. The mayor called an emergency meeting. They're proposing a memorial, a permanent exhibit about what happened. They want to put it in the courthouse, where people ignored the corruption for so long. She paused. "They want to call it the Ashcroft Truth Memorial." Anne wept at the words. Her parents' names, once erased from history, would now stand as a permanent reminder of the cost of silence and the power of courage. As the week progressed, more dominoes fell. The governor, under pressure because of his father's connection to the conspiracy, called for a comprehensive review of property transfers from 1970 to 1980. A victims' compensation fund was established. Laws were proposed to prevent similar abuses. But for Ewan, the most meaningful moment came when Iris pulled him aside one evening. "I've decided," she said. "I'm going to law school. I want to fight for people like the Ashcrofts, people who have no one else to stand up for them." Ewan pulled her into a hug, his heart full. This was Catherine's legacy too, their daughter choosing justice, choosing courage, choosing to matter. A week after the arrests, Anne held a private ceremony at the farm. She planted 2 trees, one for Calvin, one for Irene, near where the family photograph had been taken. A small plaque between them read, "Calvin and Irene Ashcroft. They fought for truth. They never surrendered." Standing there with the community gathered around, Ewan understood what they'd really accomplished. Not revenge, not even justice exactly, but something more fundamental: recognition. The Ashcrofts' suffering had been acknowledged. Their fight had been vindicated. Their voices had been heard. Preston Lockhart might spend years in prison. The conspirators might face consequences. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. The silence had been broken. The truth had won. And the families who'd been crushed could finally, after 50 years, begin to heal. 6 months later, spring arrived at the farm with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness. The land had transformed. Where dried grass once struggled, green shoots pushed through rich soil. The creek ran clear and strong, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. The barn stood straight and solid, its roof repaired, its walls reinforced. The farmhouse glowed with fresh paint and new windows that caught the morning light. But more than the physical changes, the farm had found its purpose. Ewan stood on the porch, watching visitors arrive, a school group from Billings, brought by a teacher who wanted them to understand what courage looked like. They toured the barn, now officially designated as the Ashcroft Truth Center, where Calvin's journals were displayed alongside testimonies from the families who'd suffered. Iris was leading the tour today. She'd deferred law school for a year to help establish the center, and Ewan watched with pride as she spoke to the students about justice, about speaking up, about the cost of silence. She was her mother's daughter, intelligent, passionate, committed to making things better. Anne visited every few weeks now, sometimes staying for days at a time. The farm had become a second home for her, a place to reconnect with the parents she'd lost and the childhood that had been stolen. This morning she was working in the garden she'd replanted, where her mother's once grew, tomatoes and beans and squash, the same varieties Irene had favoured. Trevor had successfully negotiated settlements with the Lockhart estate. The families affected would receive compensation, not enough to erase the damage, but enough to acknowledge it. The money meant less than the recognition. Their suffering had been real, and now it was official. Preston Lockhart was awaiting trial, his empire dismantled, his name permanently tarnished. 3 other men had already been sentenced. The governor's father, long retired, faced civil penalties, but no criminal charges due to his age and failing health. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more than anyone had dared hope for 6 months ago. Vernon had died peacefully in February, but not before seeing the arrests and hearing the apologies. His daughter had come to the funeral, the one who'd left when the family lost everything, and she'd stood in the barn and wept, finally understanding why her childhood had shattered. Sterling stopped by every morning now, helping Ewan maintain the property, teaching him the rhythms of farm life. They'd become more than neighbors. They were brothers in a way that transcended blood, bound by the shared experience of choosing courage over comfort. Beatrice came most evenings. What had started as friendship had deepened into something more, careful and genuine, 2 people who'd both known loss learning to build something new. She'd brought dinner tonight, and they'd eat on the porch as the sun set, talking about ordinary things, enjoying the simple gift of companionship. Father Bowen had performed a blessing ceremony when the Truth Center officially opened. The church had donated funds to help maintain it, and several parishioners volunteered as docents. The act of acknowledging their collective failure had somehow strengthened the community rather than dividing it. As afternoon faded toward evening, the school group departed. Ewan walked through the barn one more time, straightening displays, checking that everything was in order. Calvin's journal sat in a climate-controlled case, open to the page where he'd written, "If anyone finds this," Ewan had finished that sentence in his own way. If anyone finds this, they should care. They should fight. They should refuse to let injustice stand unchallenged, even when it's easier to look away. He touched the glass case gently. "We did it, Calvin. Your family knows the truth. Your sacrifice meant something." Outside, Anne was gathering vegetables from the garden. Iris was closing up the center. Sterling's truck was pulling into the driveway. Beatrice would arrive soon. The farm that had been a place of endings had become a place of beginnings. Ewan walked to the spot where Anne had planted her parents' memorial trees. They were small still, but growing strong, their leaves bright green against the Montana sky. Between them, the plaque caught the fading sunlight. He no longer wore Catherine's ring on a chain around his neck. He'd finally been able to let it rest with her, knowing she'd be proud of the man he'd become. The grief hadn't disappeared. It never would, but it had transformed into something else, wisdom, purpose, a deeper understanding of what mattered. Rook emerged from the barn, moving slower now but still faithful, still present. The old dog had been there for every step of this journey, and Ewan suspected he understood more than anyone gave him credit for. "Good boy," Ewan said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "None of this happens without you." As the sun sank lower, painting the fields in gold, the others gathered. Anne and Iris, Sterling and Beatrice, Father Bowen, who'd stopped by on his way home. They sat together on the porch, sharing a meal, sharing stories, sharing the comfortable silence of people who'd fought together and won. Someone asked Ewan if he'd ever imagined his life would turn out this way. He thought about the man who'd spent his last $400 on an abandoned farm, looking for a place to hide from life. He thought about finding that box, about choosing to dig deeper, about refusing to let another man's fight end in forgotten silence. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm grateful it did." As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Ewan looked at the farm, alive now, purposeful, filled with meaning. He thought about how he'd come here broken, seeking isolation, believing he had nothing left to give. He'd been wrong about all of it. The farm wasn't an ending. The buried box wasn't random chance. And rock bottom, that place he thought was the lowest point, hadn't been the end of his story. It had been the foundation on which he'd rebuilt, not just a farm, but a life. Not just his own healing, but healing for an entire community. Not just uncovering the past, but changing the future. Around him, the people he'd come to love talked and laughed. Inside the barn, Calvin's words waited to teach new generations about courage. In the garden, Irene's vegetables grew under Anne's careful hands. And everywhere, in the restored wood, the flowing creek, the solid ground beneath their feet, the truth remained. Some things once buried demand to be found. Some voices refuse to be silenced. And sometimes, the greatest act of healing is simply refusing to look away. Ewan MacAllister had come to this farm with nothing but grief and $400. He'd leave it whenever that time came, knowing he'd mattered, knowing he'd stood for something, knowing that a broken man and a faithful dog had finished what a desperate father had started 50 years ago. The truth had won. Justice had come. And the land that held so much buried pain had become finally a place of light.